Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being part of this special Lunch with the Friends program. I'm Chris Knopp, Executive Director of Friends of the Boundary Waters, and I'm here with my colleague, Dave Meier, and Cary Griffith, the author of Gunflint Falling. So very, very excited to have this special Lunch with the Friends where we combine our love of the Boundary Waters with literature here. I want to begin first by thanking everyone that came to the Capitol yesterday for our Boundary Waters Day at the Capitol and sharing your love of the Boundary Waters. It was an inspiring day to see hundreds of our supporters there connecting with our elected officials. It is so very important to convey that message to policymakers that make decisions that affect the place that we love. So very grateful that all of you came to the Capitol for Boundary Waters Day, and you are the strength of our organization, and we never forget that. Cary Griffith is a writer of a number of books here, both fiction and nonfiction. His fiction series, the Sam Rivers Mysteries there. Maybe, Cary, if you have one in arm's reach, you can. You don't have one there? Well, it will be so. He has the Sam Rivers a mystery series out there. You can pick that up. He also has a number of nonfiction books. One of which was about Gunflint burning, about the Ham Lake fire, and now this book, Gunflint Falling, about the 1990 blowdown that impacted the Boundary Waters. And I am so delighted to hand this off to Cary Griffith. Thank you for writing Gunflint Falling here. And without further ado, we'll start the PowerPoint that accompanies this and turn it over to you, Cary. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chris. Yeah, thank you, Chris, very much. And it's such an honor and a privilege to talk to all the friends. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about my book. Of course, what writer doesn't like to talk about their latest books? So, really, thank you very much. As a more tangible way of saying thanks, though, I'm going to give some listener today, some attendee of this, a free signed copy of the book, Gunflint Falling, Blowdown in the Boundary Waters. Normally when I'm, at an in-person event, I have a little contest. I'm going to do the contest today, but the person will be selected randomly. What I tell people at in-person events is that I am going to give you the answer to 3 questions, yes, no, true, false questions that I ask at the end. When it's in person, I have a show of hands. When I ask each question, I'm going to give you the answers to those in the presentation. We'll have them at the end. We'll just run through them because I can't see anyone's hands. I don't know who is eligible to win the book. So like I say, they'll be chosen randomly. But again, it's my way of saying thanks to all of you guys. Thank you. Go ahead, Chris. Oh, this is a picture. Yeah. This was actually taken at the Friends headquarters off University Avenue. I love this map. It's a map of the entire Boundary Waters on one of their walls and the surrounding area. And it kind of shows you how special this area is. I mean, it's incredible, the number of lakes, rivers, and other waterways in the area. And it just shows you why this area needs to be protected. And it's a great example of the work that you guys do with the Friends and the reason that you do it. Go ahead, Chris. Now, this is what I call shameless self-promotion. These are books. I write books about Minnesota wilderness. They're all set in Minnesota. These are my first 3 nonfiction books and my first 3 novels that came out. Go ahead, next slide. Now, of course, today we're going to talk about Gunflint Falling, Blowdown in the Boundary Waters, which is about the July 4th, 1999 blowdown. I think most people knew that. At this point, when I'm at an in-person event, I ask to see how many people remember that. I've done 3 or 4 events already. Yeah, and a lot of people like Dave, who's attending today, presenting today, remember this. Not only remember it, but I'm really surprised more than half raised their hand, and several people in the audience, or at least a few people in the audience, were actually in the blowdown or around the blowdown when it happened. And they have personal stories to tell. We're going to get into some of those personal stories here, including Dave's. I also write fiction. My next Sam Rivers novel. Sam Rivers is a special agent for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife. My next one I wanted to put up here because it's actually set on Lake Vermilion, one of my favorite lakes up in the Northeast. Most people know it. It's right on the edge of the Boundary Waters. It features walleye poachers and murderers, of course. Look for it next June. Go ahead. Now, when you write a book like Gunflint Falling, it really is a village project. And there's a lot of people to thank. I already thank Chris, who participated, not only invited me here, but he participated in my St. Paul kickoff event. He was great. We had a great crowd, lots of interest. But I also need to thank the University of Minnesota Press. They put together a great book. They produced a great book. I'm really appreciative of everybody there. I have to single out Heather Skinner. She's the director of their PR. She got me in part to participate in this event and many others this month. So particular thanks to Heather Skinner at the University of Minnesota Press. But last but not least, this book would not have been possible if it weren't for all of the people I interviewed. I talked to more than, I think, 100 people. I call out 60 in the acknowledgments, and everyone was really generous and gracious with their stories. I really appreciated their help. And like I say, this book wouldn't have been possible without their assistance. Now, when I think about this book, I think about it in 2 ways. The first is as a prequel to my last nonfiction book, Gunflint Burning, Fire in the Boundary Waters, that Chris already mentioned. That was about the Ham Lake fire of 2007. The reason I think of it as a prequel was not only because it happened 8 years before 2007, but it also, the people, I first became interested in the blowdown because the people I interviewed for that book, several of them said, the reason the Ham Lake fire burned so hot and intense and was so destructive was because of all the fuel in the Boundary Waters left over from the blowdown. And then they'd tell me this dramatic story about a friend or about themselves. They were in the middle of the blowdown, and I just really thought these stories were amazing, and I wanted to know more about it. And that was really the start of it. So I think of it as a prequel to Gunflint Burning. But I also think about it as a signal, a chronicle of one of the first extreme weather events in climate change, which we're seeing more and more of. Go ahead, Chris. Now, back in the 80s, we started talking about climate change. This features testimony by the director of NASA's Institute of Space Studies, James Hansen. He mentioned climate change and said it was going to begin affecting our climate pretty heavily. This was 11 years before the blowdown. And of course, the blowdown was 25 years ago from today. Go ahead. So one of the things that a lot of people don't know about this, I say this book is an example of one of the first extreme weather events in northern Minnesota. This storm that started in North Dakota, you can see from the map, and then, blew through northeastern Minnesota. Those black X's are where most of the damage was done. It actually traveled 6,000 miles over 3 to 4 days. This map shows the first 1,000 miles that happened in the first 24 hours. Now, amazingly, in the boundary waters, even though there were 48 million trees felled, and some of those trees were 30, 40 inches in diameter, big old growth trees, there were no fatalities. Nobody can believe that. The Forest Service planned for fatalities. They told people what to do in case they found people because they fully expected to, but it didn't. As the storm moved east, it hit southern Canada, and it did cause a couple deaths. It caused a lot of destruction. Went out into the ocean, went due south, turned inland at Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, blew through Alabama, Mississippi, the Mississippi Delta, and finally, after 3 or 4 days, burned itself out in the Gulf of Mexico. It traveled 6,000 miles. So again, another way I think about this book is as a chronicle of one of the first extreme weather events, of which we are seeing more and more due to climate change. Go ahead. Now, this is a map I wanted to show because of the red area. That red area was actually, it was about 4 to 6 miles wide, or wider in some places, and 30 to 40 miles long. It was pretty much 100% blowdown. It says 67 to 100%, but it was pretty much 100%. Now, I tell a lot of stories in this book about people who were hurt in the storm, or a handful of them anyway. One of them happened in Lake Polly, and if you go right below that BWCAW, yeah, right in there, that's where Lake Polly is. This map, part of the reason I wanted to show this is this map didn't get lots of the areas of where blowdown happened because it was so intermittent. So you can see the heart of the blowdown was in that area of red, but around it, there's lots of yellow, and a lot of the yellow they didn't get because it was too small. Lake Polly, where one of the people I talk about got injured, is one of those types of areas. Go ahead. Now, this is an interesting map because it shows the heart of the storm trajectory as it blew from west to east, northeast. And I talk about Ranger Nicole Selmer, a Ranger Pete Weckman. I'm going to mention them today. And I also talk about some campers, camper Vicki Brockman and camper Lisa Noss, who was in that Lake Polly area. Now, I think, if I remember correctly, Dave, you were in that in the Lake Polly area, or near there.
Yeah, actually at about the same level below the storm line there to the right of Brule Lake, which is where the mouse is right now. We went in on Bower Trout Lake, entry point number 43, and then did about 5 portages into Swan. And so we saw, we weren't at the center of the storm trajectory where so many trees were lost, but we saw definitely a number of trees that were down. It felt like a lot, but not like total destruction, like even just above there where that line was falling.
Yeah. Did you want to? You have some pictures to share of that event, don't you?
Yeah. I can jump in here and show some of those. So my wife Michelle and I were in the Boundary Waters on the 4th of July in 1999. We had just gotten married, and I had it in my head that, it'd be fun to do kind of a Boundary Waters honeymoon. And actually, Cary, I found it interesting in your book. There was a couple that was up there for a honeymoon, and so, but we'd gone on a proper honeymoon. We went to Greece and spent all of our vacation time. So all we had left was 3 days, 3-day weekends to get to the Boundary Waters. And so we went up there and went in on Saturday. And let me just share my screen here. So this is heading into the Boundary Waters. We went about 5 lakes into Swan Lake. As I said, most of the portages were about 30, 40 rods. One fun thing about that trip was we saw a lot of moose, more moose than I'd ever seen. So I've often wondered if the moose kind of knew something that was up. One thing they did know was up was it was really hot. And you mentioned that in your book, Cary, that just how kind of hot and sticky it was. So we saw, a bull moose with the water going over as he was cooling himself with the rack there in the lake. And then we saw this mama and a calf. And that was a really exciting thing about the trip on the way in. One other thing about the trip on the way in, my wife had never she's kind of petite, and I'd only been up there mostly with my dad, who's a 200-pound man. We'll say 190, Dad. Anyway, so I'd packed with one big Duluth pack and then the canoe, and Michelle couldn't carry it. So we were double portaging. I was carrying everything, which kind of came into play on the way out. So we got to Swan Lake and we set up, and then I was out the next day fishing, and I ended up, was focused on fishing, caught a fish. And then all of a sudden, right after that, I looked up and I just saw the sky was just green. And just instantly I knew trouble, because you hear about green sky being, like tornadic activity and where some really significant weather trouble can be. So I booked it back to camp. And so this picture would have been taken right as the storm was rolling in, because I saw the storm rolling in, and I remember I made the decision to it's going to be storming later. Maybe I better clean this fish now fast. So I got, started cleaning the fish, getting it ready for dinner. And then I got about halfway through, and then the wind just started blowing so much. Michelle was cruising around the campsite, picking things up, putting them in the tent. And I got about halfway through the fish, and I just had to put it down and run for the tent. And I'd been in a tent before. Yeah, go ahead.
I see it was really hot that day, but is this rain gear that you put on because you thought it was going to rain?
It must be. Yeah. I think that it was starting to rain and blow. You can see this is around noontime, and you can see how dark it was there. So cleaning that fish and then running for the tent. And I'd been in a storm once that had flattened my tent and broken the poles when I was in Glacier National Park working there for a summer. And so I was determined that we were not going to let this tent fall down. And so Michelle and I were in the tent holding up the sides of the tent because it was really starting to blow. And just that tent fabric would just flap, 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 flap right next to our heads. And so we were just basically terrified, holding this tent up, spread out against the one wall so that it wouldn't fall, because it was a cheap tent with fiberglass poles, and we were in there for what felt like forever. But it was probably, 45 minutes, an hour, and it still was flapping around. But after that intense part, it just seemed to lighten a little bit. We stuck our heads out of the tent, and that's when it dawned on me kind of the significance of the storm. There were 2 trees. This shot only shows one, but 2 trees where it just pulled the tree down by the root ball right next to the tent. And that's my little, it's already kind of bent up. You can see the tent is kind of bent. And then looking out towards the lake, you can see here's a tree that was just cut off at about chest height. I read a lot about that in your book too, Cary, where a lot of the trees were kind of sheared off, 10, 20 feet in the air, and the treetops were just ripped off of the tree trunks. And we saw that in our campsite as well. But you can see, there's still a number of trees up after the storm there. But there were also a lot down. And so again, as there was a process of the storm dawning on us, like the scope of it. But once we got through it, I probably cleaned the other half of the fish, getting it ready for dinner, and then getting ready to just go back to use the bathroom. And just that little trail between the campsite and the pit toilet we had to climb all the way to the pit toilet over all the trees. And so this is that path going back into the woods. And then I'll tell you, just we had one more night, and then our weekend was up. We headed out, and all the portages looked like this too, just matchsticks, pickup sticks, just stacked up about 6, 7, 8, 10 feet high, where I had to climb with the canoe over all of the trees. So I know that also played a role in your book, Cary, of just all the the portages being blocked and having it being difficult to get to people. Luckily, we were able to manage, and so fortunately, we were not hurt, because I was sitting in that tent as I looked out, going like, should we have been in the tent? Should we have been outside dodging trees? What's the right thing to do? And I think with a storm like that, I don't know if there really is a right place to be for something like that. So anyway, we fortunately made it out just fine, and with a little bit of extra work and some double portaging over the trees, and headed back to Grand Marais, where we checked out at the ranger station. And again, the scope of this, talking to the ranger, like, hey, you might want to go up by Swan Lake there. There's some portages kind of blocked by some trees. There was a cell that hit that lake pretty hard. I was thinking it was tornadic activity, having no idea of the scope of the event that we saw. So, whoops. Am I
Yeah, a
still
lot of
sharing
people,
here?
a lot of people said that same thing, Dave. They just, they didn't. A lot of people in Grand Marais didn't even know anything happened at the end of the Gunflint Trail.
Yeah. Well, and it was fun to read in your book just all the different things that were happening across the Boundary Waters, a tapestry of people, and just to hear what other people were doing during the storm, like the director of Wilderness Canoe Base, how he borrowed a chainsaw so he could get back up the Gunflint Trail. And we saw that as we were coming down the Gunflint Trail, where there were trees all down, but we could kind of just get by because people had been through there already by July 5th, kind of clearing it out for, what ended up being kind of rescue and cleanup activities.
Yeah, it was really the last 20 miles or so of the Gunflint Trail that got hit the hardest. The Gunflint Trail goes kind of northwest out of Grand Marais, and the storm kind of eclipsed that end of the Gunflint Trail. So it wasn't too bad until you got up to Trail Center, and then it started to go back. You asked, like, what can people do? I should mention this. One of the guys I interviewed and wrote up his piece for the book to be included in it was Wilderness Ranger John Pierce. He's still in Ely, still works for the Forest Service. Great guy, has a really dramatic, compelling story, but he had an experience in 95 that convinced him anytime you go in the Boundary Waters, you should in the summer, because storms happen in the summer and they always come out of the west, according to John. So anytime you go into the Boundary Waters, you should always get in a western campsite. I'm sorry, how does this go? It's an eastern campsite that faces west. Then if inclement weather comes up or a bad blowstorm, no matter how much it blows, counterintuitively, you run into the storm until you can get to the shoreline, and then you won't have to worry about being killed by falling trees because they're falling behind you. I thought that was really interesting. I actually wrote that piece up, and because it wasn't part of the narrative I was trying to tell, I had to cut it in the end. But his story is going to appear in an upcoming issue of Minnesota Conservation Volunteer, and it has that lesson in it. And I would think many of the friends would be interested in that lesson. I know if I ever go into the Boundary Waters in midsummer, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to look for a western facing on an eastern campsite that faces due west, someplace I can get to the shoreline in case bad weather starts coming out of the west.
Plus the sunsets are better, right?
Yeah, yes, exactly. Okay, go ahead, Chris. Now, what was really one of the, of course, this is a story about the weather. And one of the things that, like you, Dave, when you went in, did you say the second or the third? I
Third,
think it
yes.
was. Third was a Saturday. You went in on the third, and so if you had looked at forecasts, if you looked at the one that came out of the Duluth National Weather Service, you would have seen they predicted the 4th of July would be warm and humid with a 30% chance of thunderstorms. Nothing too traumatic. The weather headquarters of the National Weather Service is in Norman, Oklahoma. They were actually keeping an eye on some storms that were developing in Montana and western South Dakota, but they didn't really think it would amount to much. They just thought, it would fizzle out by the time it hit northwestern Minnesota. Now, one thing I learned about when I was doing research for this book is that there's 122 regional National Weather Service stations. The one responsible for forecasts and tracking the weather in the northeast of Minnesota is out of Duluth. It's the Duluth station. The one that's responsible for northwestern Minnesota, like Bemidji and that whole area, is in Grand Forks. And because weather in the summer comes out of the west, Duluth is always tracking what their sister office is doing in Grand Forks, and they tend to follow the forecasts that come out of Grand Forks. Well, of course, even as late as 7 a.m. on July 4th, the morning, that Sunday morning, in Grand Forks, they issued a forecast that said, well, it's going to be warm. The winds might be 10 to 20 miles per hour, possibly gusty. 45 minutes later, those storms that were being tracked by Norman, Oklahoma, by the headquarters, they said that the phrase they used was the nature of them abruptly changed. And they turned into this intense squall line that blew through Fargo and did all kinds of damage. Immediately after that, they issued a severe thunderstorm watch for the Bemidji area. And not long after that, of course, then Duluth tracks with it. They see it on their radar and they issue a warning to they say that there could be severe thunderstorms for the Ely area and for the Boundary Waters. Now, mind you, this was in 1999. And so a lot of people were in the Boundary Waters like you were, Dave. They were almost all the people I talk about in the book were already in the Boundary Waters. So they had no way of knowing that, hearing the forecasts or the warnings by the National Weather Service. They were just in the Boundary Waters enjoying the 4th of July. It was so hot that most people I interviewed were taking dips, swimming, standing under a wilderness shower, whatever it happened to be. So anyway, most of the people I interviewed in the book were completely caught unawares, and there was no anticipation that this significant weather event, the one that traveled 6,000 miles, was going to start right up in northwestern Minnesota. Go ahead, Chris. Now, I talk about two wilderness rangers, Nicole Selmer. She was in the wilderness with several volunteers, 8 volunteers, and they were working on working on portages, cleaning up portages between Mudrow Lake and Fortown Lake. I mentioned Nicole's story because she's really on the north end of the storm, the main storm trajectory. Nonetheless, she has a powerful story to tell. It's similar to yours, Dave, in that you were way south, but you were still hit by significant winds. So was Nicole, and it's an example of how wide the damage from this storm actually was as it traveled east-northeast. I also tell the story of Ranger Pete Weckman, who he went out the morning of the 4th of July. He heard that there was a chance of thunderstorms. He knew that there was bad weather, but he was going to go up there anyway. and he was going to go up the Moose Lake chain. I included his story because he was right in the heart of the storm, and the story he tells about sitting in his truck as the storm comes on is really harrowing. Another interesting thing about this is that the wilderness rangers in the boundary waters are divided into the western region and the eastern region. Bruce Slover was the head of the wilderness rangers in the western region. He was out of Ely, and he had a different philosophy than Joe Barnier, who was his colleague in charge of the wilderness rangers on the eastern region. Bruce thought the 4th of July would see a lot of people in the wilderness. And so he wanted most of his rangers to be in the wilderness. That's why Pete Wetman went in that day. And that's part of the reason why Nicole Selmer was there. Joe thought that most people spent 4th of July at home and that kind of thing. So she didn't have nearly as many wilderness rangers in the wilderness during the blowdown. So it was just kind of an interesting anecdote that I learned when I was doing research for this. Go ahead, Chris. Now, one of the groups I talk about, and I like this because it's a story that is people can really resonate with. There's 3 women. They had met not too long before they ended up going into the wilderness. Actually, Jan and Vicky had been good friends, and they'd taken several wilderness trips, and they met Sue Ann Martinson, who was 55. Jan and Vicky were a little younger. And Sue Ann had never been in the Boundary Waters. She's from the Twin Cities. She'd always wanted to go to the Boundary Waters. And so Jan and Vicky said, hey, we have done this wonderful route. I'm going to tell you about it in a sec. It's a fairly well-known route. And they said, you should come with us. We'll rent one canoe and we'll head up. And, you know, the other thing, Vicky liked to go with Jan Fiola because Jan Fiola was a gourmet wilderness cook. So they'd eat really well in the wilderness. And of course, Sue Ann liked that. So go ahead, next slide. So what they planned on doing is driving up to the end of the trail campground on July 1st. And then on July 2nd, they were going to go over to Way of the Wilderness Outfitters, rent a canoe and get their stuff. And the first day they were going to paddle up into Saginaw and they were going to go, that's exactly right, Chris, and then go down to the southwest and still in Saginaw, right around there, they camped on an island that first night, July 2nd. Then on July 3rd, they wake up and they're going to portage through Red Rock Lake, which they do. And again, Jan and Vicky are familiar with this because they've done it before. And they go through Red Rock Lake and they go into Alpine Lake. And their idea is that on the 3rd, Saturday the 3rd, they're going to go to this one campsite that they like that's very close to the portage from Alpine into Seagull. Go to the next slide, Chris. And this is where their campsite was. That portage there, that Chris is identifying with his mouse. That is a long portage, but it's the most typical way people come and go from Seagull to Alpine. Now, what's interesting about this is that you can see to the right of there's another little portage, and that's the one almost everybody after the storm has to take. You mentioned, Dave, how the portages were, you had to kind of struggle to get over. That Alpine portage, which is about 1/5 of a mile long, I want to say, was just devastated. I mean, it was completely choked, just like pickup sticks. The trees had just fallen across it. In fact, some people that ultimately go in to rescue Vicky Brockman have to haul their canoe 10 feet off the ground, crawling over this windfall that happened to get in to help her out. Okay, so go to the next slide. Oh, so this is the other one. But the other thing I wanted to mention about their idea was, Vicki Brockman's idea was, we'll spend 4th of July. Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, thank you. We'll spend 4th of July at this campsite. And then on the 5th, Monday, we'll do the portage into Seagull, and we'll paddle out to our car at the parking lot at the end of the Seagull Lake there, and we'll drive home. That was their plan. Okay, next. Now, I also tell the story about some 5 friends who go into Lake Polly. Ray Oreo, who's familiar and was kind of the wilderness, he was sort of the leader of the group. Ray knew of this campsite he wanted to go and stay on Lake Polly. And so he and his wife, Michelle, they drove up July 1st, and their plan was they were going to drive up, score the campsite, and then on Saturday, Christina and Mark Schwendiger and their friend Lisa Nass were going to follow them in. Yeah, this is what they were going to do. They were going that down at the bottom of that map is the Kawishua entry point, and that there's a campground there. They were you go as soon as you get into that lake. Yeah, you go through all those portages up to the desired campsite, and sure enough, Ray and Michelle got that on the 2nd, and by the 3rd they were all in camp, and the idea was they'd wake up the morning of the 4th, they'd have a great day in the woods, and then on the 5th they'd all reverse down the portages and paddle out and head home. So go ahead, next slide. So here's what happens right around noon, and I don't know if Dave, it was right around noon for you. It was definitely for Vicki Brockman, who was, I think, just about due north of you. But right around noon, they huddle in their tent. All hell breaks loose, and it is really significant. And there's a tree, jack pine, right behind their thing, and all 3 of them are huddled in the tent. Vicki Brockman lays on her side, and she gets kind of in a fetal position. And the tree falls directly on Vicki Brockman's hip, and it shatters her pelvis. Now, obviously, she can't move. There's no way she's going to portage anywhere. The only way they're going to get her out is to medevac. All afternoon, people are swarming out. If you don't go back to the image, but if you remember that picture of where their campsite was on Alpine Lake, there's a lot of campers on Alpine Lake. That's in the Boundary Waters. Lots of Boundary Waters people go there because it's felt relatively close and easy to get into. Lots of campers were in there, and they just all started streaming out. So every time somebody went by their campsite, Jan Fiola and Sue Ann Martinson would say, "Hey, tell them we've got somebody injured here. We have to medevac her out. She can't move." Same thing with Lisa. In Lisa's campsite, the blowdown started to come through, much like I think it did in your campsite. It didn't fell everything. It did pretty much fell everything in Vicki Brockman's, but in Lisa's campsite, it came through really harsh winds, really strong. Trees were breaking. At a moment in the middle of the storm, Lisa looks down to where her boat was pulled up on the shore there, and she sees the wind is so strong, it's starting to move. She got a really small canoe for her solo, and it's starting to move. It's a Kevlar. It was very light. It was starting to push it, and she was afraid it was going to get lost or it was going to get blown away. And so she ran down to secure it. And once she was down there by the canoe, a tree broke off and the branch grazed her head. If it had hit her 2 inches over, it would have crushed her skull. As it was, it knocked her unconscious, and she was in a world of hurt. Okay, go ahead. Now, the Schwendigers, they're in Lake Polly, and there aren't as many campsites. There's not as much traffic. They realize if we're going to help our friend Lisa Nass, both the Oreos and the Schwendigers thought somebody's got to go for help. So the Schwendigers, both Mark and Christina, say, "Okay, Let's paddle like hell. We're going to go out the way we came in. They get out to a campground. Amazingly, their cell phone, they're able to get coverage. They drive up to a hill. They're able to get coverage, enough coverage to tell the authorities that where Lisa Nass is on this Lake Polly. And they actually late in the day, they get a plane in and medevac her to Ely. Similarly, Vicki Brockman it's almost getting towards dusk. And the last trip that pilot Pat Lowe takes that day is to pick up Vicki Brockman. You know, in the Forest Service, they're doing medevacs all day, helping people out from noon on. They can only go from sundown to sunset, so they were hurrying to get everybody out that they could. And Vicki Brockman was Pat Lowe's last plane flight. He takes her to Ely along and his fellow Wayne Erickson, another Bush pilot, takes Lisa to Ely. They both get there within like an hour or two apart. The doctor examines them both. There's a small hospital in Ely, and he says, "Wow, there's nothing I can do for you guys. We've got to get an ambulance and rush you down to the Trauma One Center in Duluth." And that's what they do. Now, go ahead, next slide. Now, this, I kind of think truth is stranger than fiction, because both of these people, I didn't know this at the time when I was interviewing them, and all of a sudden they end up in the same ambulance. Vicki Brockman is really hurt pretty bad, but she's coherent, she's conscious, she's been given some painkillers, so she's comfortable. Lisa Nass next to her is in and out of consciousness. She is not doing well at all. They both get down to the trauma center. The doctors examine Vicki and they say more or less, there's nothing we can really do. We can't put a cast on you. We can't operate. You just have to stay put for 7 to 10 days and let your body heal itself. And that's what they do. And ultimately, it works for her. It's really good, but she just has to be kept calm. Lisa is very different. The first thing they do is alleviate the pressure on her skull. And so they kind of have to do some surgery on her skull in order to do that. She almost dies, but she comes out of it once they release the pressure, and she makes a full recovery too. Next slide. Now, this slide, actually, for some reason, it didn't come. This is another Superior National Forest image of the damage. This includes some of the damage in Ontario as well, but you can see there the boundary waters where it was hit. I note a bunch of stuff to the right here. By the numbers, the July 4th, 99 blowdown happened from approximately noon to 2 o'clock, or a little before noon to 2 o'clock over that entire area. It flattened the BWCA, created a flattened space 40 miles long and 5 to 10 miles wide. It felled an estimated 48 million trees, damaged 487,000 acres. And at its peak, within the 2 weeks following the event, there were 310 personnel working on it. And it cost almost $1 million in those first 2 weeks, trying to get into the forest, save people. Like I say, they always thought they were going to find a fatality, but fortunately they didn't. One other thing I have to mention that I forgot is back when I was talking about the extreme weather event, seldom does a derecho happen at the latitude that this derecho happened. And it's another example of climate change. Most derechos, I cover this in the book, happen further south in southern Minnesota, southern Wisconsin, Iowa, Missouri. Most of the derechos that happen further south. But again, this was an example of an extreme weather event, which we're seeing more and more of as climate change continues. Next slide. Okay, this is the part where I normally give a book away, by a show of hands. Now, I can't do that here, but I'm going to give you the questions. One of the injured people chronicled in Gunflint Falling is referred to as Jane Doe. True, false? Of course, I know you guys are all astute listeners, so you'd say, no, nobody was. He didn't mention anybody named Jane Doe, so everybody would still be in the running. On July 4th, 99, the blowdown felled 48 million trees. Again, I just gave you that statistic. Yes, that's true. Derecho straight line winds that travel more than 250 miles are common in the BWCA. Yes or no? Dave, Chris? No. Yes, yes. And all your listeners, I'm sure, would get that too. So after this is over, I'm going to work with Dave to get a list of people, and we'll randomly use a number process or something to get this. And go ahead, Chris. Is there something else you wanted? Okay. Oh yeah, these are some upcoming events I have. Tomorrow I'll be in Grand Marais at Drury Lane Books, and then Saturday I'll be at Fitker's Books in Duluth from 4 to 5. Thank you, you guys. I really, really appreciate it. And is there time for any questions?
Absolutely, Cary. Thank you so much for that. We do have a few questions out here, and so we've talked a bit about the impact on humans there, and that no one was killed, but we talked about the injuries here. Now, in your book, you have a couple anecdotes about wildlife, and so maybe I'll present the question in two ways. So what were some of the behavioral impacts on wildlife in the storm before the storm hit, and what's the impact on wildlife after the storm?
Yeah, that's one of the things. I talk a little bit about that in the book. Of course, it's a human conceit that we're most concerned about the humans when, as Dave was showing you in his slides, one of the reasons we go into the wilderness is to see moose, to see the wildlife. And the wildlife really suffered in this storm. I tell the story of Pete Weckman going up that Moose Lake chain. He's coming back after dark, and he's coming through a little narrows, and he looks up and he's completely lost because he is really familiar with that whole area. But in the past, before the storm, he would look up and he'd see a huge white pine with a giant eagle's nest in it, and he could always use that for a landmark on the horizon. Coming back, the tree was gone, the nest was gone, and that's a nesting site. Who knows if there were eaglets in there, or even if there weren't, that the eagles come back and use that year in and year out. There were lots of interesting animal anecdotes in this book. That there were horses over in Tofty that marched in a parade on July 4th. And this was several hours before a major storm blew through Tofty on the evening of the 4th of July. There were kind of two storms that blew through. The one that happened in the noon, and then another one followed that dropped 17 inches of rain on Tofty. Two horses refused to get into a trailer. They knew something around noon in Tofty was coming. They knew stuff was going to happen. The only other thing I'd say is that I'm sure one of the other things Pete Weckman talked about was seeing in the heart of the storm, when the winds must have been blowing about 100 miles per hour, waterfowl trying to get up and just being battered and twisted around. And so I'm sure that happened quite a bit. And I think the woods were really quiet. One other thing is that one of Nicole Selmer's people told me that afterwards that evening, one of the most haunting sounds are the loons. And the loons afterwards, I don't know if Dave, you remember this or you experienced it at all.
I remember.
They did not sound right. And when they called, they had different calls than you would normally hear. from loons, at night up in the boundary waters. And I always thought, I'm sure, I don't know, none of my research did I turn up statistics on the impact on the wildlife, but you got to believe it was pretty significant.
Well, I definitely remember the moose, and just the number of moose that we saw was by far more than we'd ever seen. So I think it's partially the area, and I'd like to go back there, but also, I feel like they might have known that something was up.
Yeah.
But Cary, I was really interested in all the human stories in your book, and to me it appeared just like a tapestry of different stories happening across this map of the boundary waters, and I loved how the different stories weave together. And I'm just wondering about your process as an author, like how, you talked to me for the book, and how did you find people for the book, and then as you're interviewing people, how did you find the connections, and how did you know when you had a really interesting piece, either that connected to another piece or that just like was worth mentioning, even if it was just like a small detail?
Yeah, well, I really wanted to tell sort of a narrative. I could have told a lot more stories. I could have told your story, or I could have told, but it's easier to pay attention when you're only dealing with a few people and a few of their stories over the trajectory of what happened in the blowdown. As it is, I told quite a few stories, as you alluded to, Dave, and I didn't want it to make it any more complicated than it already was, mentioning everyone. Finding people, I started with those folks from the blowdown, or from the Fire in the Boundary Waters book. Lots of those people also worked, the Forest Service people and the DNR people worked on the blowdown. And they knew people. And there was a book that came out, a self-published book that Jim Cordist, who worked for the Forest Service, I think, put out 2 years later, called Our Wounded Wilderness. There it is. Yeah. Great book. It was really a compendium of, anecdotes from the newspapers up there and all that kind of thing. It was, but it was really useful in identifying people that then I went out and tried to find. Of course, some of them weren't that easy to find. Lisa Noss had gotten married. I had to find her through the Schwendingers, I think, or through the friends that she went with. But that was how I found them. Yeah, then once I found them, I'd call up and see if they were interested in telling their story. By the way, not everyone was. Some people weren't, because I think it was such a traumatic event, they just didn't want to get into the details of it. But some people were.
Interesting. Thank you. Chris, you're on mute.
There was a question, and I can pose this to you too, Dave, about in the wake of this storm. Do you carry a sat phone, or to a lot of the, this was at a time when not many people had cell phones, and so it was a bit of a communication gap, and you get into that, Cary, in the book there. So, what I mean, what do you all carry in the boundary waters? Do you carry a sat phone or some other way of connecting in the case of an emergency? Dave, what do you do?
I mostly just, I'd say, rely on the people that I'm with, and so I haven't ever carried communication up there. Although now cell phone's the camera, so I've been doing that. But I'm gonna maybe go on a solo trip this year, and I might consider it for that, just because if you get in trouble, that little bit of emergency help could be the difference in between life and death. And I know when we got out of the boundary waters, I went to a payphone to communicate with my work, because all that rainfall that happened, that second wave of the storm, they closed Highway 61 for a while. So we were kind of stuck in Grand Marais. And as I said, we were out of vacation days. So I had to call work and be like, sorry, I'm not coming. So we had to get a room there. But I remember going to the outdoor payphone and dialing up and being able to get through. And luckily they were relieved and said, yeah, go ahead and stay. What about you, Cary? Do you carry something like that?
I usually don't go very far into the boundary waters. I come back to a bed at night and then paddle into the boundary waters along the edges. But if I was going to do an extensive trip, I think I'd take both a sat phone, and then they have these personal locators. I forget what they call them. They're little devices, and then you can press a button, and if things get hairy, or if you get injured or something, and they'll
Yeah.
use them to come find you.
Spot devices, and a couple of our viewers here mentioned that. Yes, the spot devices. Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you can usually hook those things up through an outfitter would have
Mhm.
access. So I don't know. I've got to figure that out with the sat phone myself because I've never done that. So that'll be a new adventure.
Yeah.
You
I have
know,
to say,
Cary,
with regard to technology, you were alluding to that, you used a payphone. If this would have happened today, everybody would have immediately known about it. We would have had tons of video. We would have incredible pictures. As it was 2-3 days before anybody knew anything like this happened in the Boundary Waters. It's really a testament to how far we've come with communications like cell phones and iPhones.
Cary, we have a question about sort of the aftermath of this. In your book, you talk about the from January 5th to the 19th and that, but afterwards, the clearing of the portages and that, why don't you briefly talk about what it was, the recovery, if you would, of it, what a year later, 3 years later, about how the portages were cleared or whatever. Kind of go into that sort of after the blowdown.
Yeah, sure. One of the interesting things that some of the rangers said to me was, we had no idea that when this storm happened, I would be working on this for the rest of my career. And some of these guys were talking about 5, 7, 10 years out. They were looking at retirement. And they had to go in and, recovery. They were going initially. They went in to just cut trails through the portages to make sure there wasn't anybody dead in there, or to see if there was anybody injured that still needed assistance. But in the aftermath, in the weeks and months, and at least for the first 2 years, they were going into rehab campsites, to rehab portages, to do all kinds of stuff, and it just took a long time. I remember, his nickname was Blade. He worked for the Forest Service. Really, Tom Caffeine. He's passed away, but he told me when I was initially doing research, how he worked with volunteers. A lot of, not volunteers, but a lot of Forest Service workers from all over the nation came he managed a group of Forest Service people from like California to help clear up the border route trail that goes through the Boundary Waters. There are a lot of those trails that had to be cleaned up and, refurbed. And, they couldn't do it. They had to use hand tools, right? With the exception of, in the immediate aftermath, Jim Sanders, the forest supervisor, said, okay, let's use chainsaws until we make sure everybody's okay. Then they went back to hand tools.
Well, it was a very good nickname for a ranger that ended up cutting down a lot of trees, right, Cary, after after the aftermath of that. And
Yeah.
yes, that was really interesting. That sort of it was a big deal decision to allow chainsaws to do that. It was kind of a really big decision there. Why, super. We are at the end of our hour, Cary and Dave, and I want to thank both of you and thank all of our listeners here. I want to thank everyone that was again at Boundary Waters Day at the Capitol. And I'm going to put a couple dates, and maybe I'll quickly share my screen for folks. here one last time here. And we are looking next Thursday to have and I see I misspelled legislative here, but we're going to have a prove it first non-legislative hearing to talk about our legislation. That'll be a week from today in the afternoon. More information to come on that. And then we are having a training on our Prove It First resolution process for the precinct caucuses on February 27th. That training will be on next Wednesday, the 21st. So that'll be both a hybrid, both at our offices here in St. Paul and via Zoom. So a couple on that advocacy and a couple things to look forward here. And you know, this is Cary, again, I love your writing. I love the stories there. And then it's a real inspiration. And Dave, thank you so much for sharing your real world experiences there on July 4th, 1999. It's been such a pleasure. So see Cary up in, I know a few folks I see in the audience there might be up the Gunflint Trail. Come down to Grand Marais tomorrow, and you know a few folks on the line we're in Duluth, so you can meet Cary in Duluth on Saturday. So again, thanks to both of you, and thanks to all our participants here that were viewing this. You are the strength of Friends of the Boundary Waters. We're about people, and thank you so much for being here. Have a great afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much.